The wind that night howled like something alive, shrieking through the cracks of the crooked shack where an Apache girl named Apache stood still as a post. Outside, Wyoming's plains stretched endless and empty, a white wilderness swallowed by a blizzard. Inside, a fire hissed low in the hearth, its glow falling across the scarred table where two men faced each other, one pale with loss, the other with greed. Her uncle reeked of whiskey and regret. His fingers drummed against the wood, impatient, twitching. He was a man half consumed by the frontier and the bitterness it bred. Across from him sat Clayton Ward, a widowed rancher with a reputation for silence. His coat was still dusted with snow from the ride, his hat resting in his lap. He looked more like a ghost than a man. Tall, weather-beaten and hollow-eyed, the kind of hollow that came from burying love with your own two hands. "I told you," her uncle muttered, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "She's untouched. Strong too. Been raised tough. You won't find a more obedient girl this side of the mountains." Clayton said nothing. Akacheta's hands were bound around her own waist, gripping the coarse shawl her mother had made years ago. She stared at the flickering light, refusing to meet either man's eyes. Her heartbeat was steady, though her throat burned with shame. Her uncle smirked, leaning closer to the fire. "She'll keep your house in order, look after your young'uns. A fair trade, I'd say. $50 and she's yours." The silence between them stretched thin as wire. Then came the sound. A soft clink, a small leather pouch tossed onto the table. Clayton slid it forward. Silver coins spilled from the opening, catching the firelight like frozen tears. That was the sound of her freedom leaving. Clayton stood, his face unreadable, and adjusted his gloves. "We're done here." Her uncle nodded greedily, scooping up the pouch with trembling hands. "Take care of her, rancher. She don't talk much, but she's steady, like a mule." Akacheta's gaze didn't shift. She knew better than to cry. In her tribe, tears were for the dying, and she wasn't dead yet. When Clayton turned to leave, he didn't offer his hand, or even his name. She followed him quietly, her moccasins brushing over the frozen dirt floor. Behind her, the door slammed shut, cutting off the warmth of the fire for good. The snow outside was a living thing, screaming, swirling, erasing everything behind them as soon as the wagon wheels turned. The horses groaned under the weight of the storm, their breath fogging the night air. Inside the covered wagon, Akacheta sat on a wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap. Clayton drove in silence. The only sounds were the wind and the dull creak of the wheels as they rolled over ice-crusted earth. She studied the man beside her in stolen glances. He didn't look cruel, just tired. Bone-deep tired. The lines on his face weren't the marks of age, but of endurance. His eyes, gray and cold as ash, looked straight ahead, unblinking. He never once looked at her. Hours passed. The snow came down harder. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath misting before her face. She thought of her mother's voice, the lullabies sung beside the fire. She remembered the way her father used to trace stars with his finger and tell her, "Even the lost ones find their way home." But there was no home left now. Only wind, only whiteness, only the sound of hooves breaking the quiet world apart. It was near midnight when they reached the Ward Ranch. The storm had softened into a restless whisper, the kind that creeps under doors and finds every crack in the wall. Akacheta stepped down from the wagon, her moccasins sinking into the snow. The land stretched wide and unforgiving, a sweep of fences, dark barns, and one 2-story house standing like a sentinel against the horizon. Smoke curled thinly from its chimney, more out of habit than warmth. Clayton took the reins to the stable, leaving her to follow. She did, slow and uncertain. When she reached the porch, 3 small faces stared at her through the window. Children. The eldest, a boy maybe 8 or 9, had his father's eyes, cautious and guarded. Beside him stood a smaller boy clutching his sleeve, and a little girl half hidden behind them, thumb in her mouth. Their stares were a mix of curiosity and fear. Akacheta offered a faint smile. None of them returned it. When the front door opened, the heat inside hit her like a forgotten memory. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet. Apples, maybe, from a pie long since gone cold. Clayton motioned to a narrow staircase. "You'll sleep upstairs," he said simply, his voice rough from disuse. "The room on the left." She nodded, clutching her shawl tighter. He turned and walked back toward the barn without another word. His boots echoed against the floor, then faded, leaving her in a silence so complete she could hear her own breath. Upstairs, the room waited. Bare walls, a wooden bed, a single window half frozen with frost. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs. She ran her palm across the quilt. It was stiff, untouched for years. As she lay down that night, the bed creaked like it remembered someone else's dreams. The rancher's dead wife, the one whose shadow still lived in the corners. Akacheta turned her face towards the window, where the wind moaned like a coyote in mourning. She whispered a prayer to the stars, not for escape, not for mercy, but for strength. Morning came gray and brittle. She rose before dawn, her breath clouding in the air. The floorboards groaned beneath her bare feet as she made her way downstairs. The children were already at the table, silent and stiff, as if waiting for orders. Clayton sat at the head, coffee steaming in his mug. He looked up when she entered but said nothing. "I can work," she said quietly, her voice rough from the cold. He nodded once. "Start with the stove." The iron stove in the kitchen was temperamental, older than the house itself. She fumbled with it at first, nearly choking the fire. The youngest, the little girl, giggled, a shy, surprised sound. Akacheta looked up, caught her eyes, and smiled. The girl ducked her head but didn't hide. That small sound lingered in the air like the first bird call of spring. Throughout the day, she worked without rest, fetching water from the pump, sweeping ash, chopping vegetables. The tasks were strange, but not impossible. She'd been taught to survive, to adapt. When the sun dipped below the ridge, she wiped her hands on her skirt and stepped outside. The land was still vast and cruel, but under the fading light, it seemed almost tender. Snow glittered on the fence rails, turning the world into glass. Somewhere behind her, she heard Clayton's boots crunching the snow. He stopped a few paces away. "You did good work," he said after a long pause. She turned. His expression didn't change, but his voice had softened. Barely. "Thank you," she murmured. For a moment, the wind died, leaving only the sound of their breathing. 2 strangers standing in the cold, both too proud and too wounded to speak more. Then he turned back toward the barn. "Supper's at 6, he said, his tone back to its steady, distant drawl. When she went to bed that night, Akacheta stared at the ceiling until sleep finally took her. The snow outside whispered against the window pane, a quiet rhythm that sounded almost like words. "You're still here. You're still here." And so began her new life, one day folding into the next, each moment built from silence, small tasks, and a slow, steady thaw neither of them could name yet. Akacheta was no longer a daughter, no longer a wife, Not even a prisoner. She was something the prairie itself understood. A survivor. And as she drifted into sleep, she could almost feel the land breathing beneath her. Cold, wild, and waiting. The days came hard and left quietly. Out on the Wyoming plains, time didn't move in hours or minutes. It drifted like snow, piling up slow, quiet, and heavy. At the Ward Ranch, every sound carried. The creak of the barn door, the hiss of the kettle, the whimper of the wind through the shutters. Akacheta learned that silence could be as loud as thunder. Life here wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was steady, like the ache in a man's bones before rain. The mornings began before the first light crawled over the hills. She'd wrap her shawl around her shoulders, step out into the biting cold, and haul water from the pump. Her breath came out in white clouds. The handle froze to her palm, but she kept pumping until the bucket filled. Inside, the stove wheezed and spit smoke if not handled right. It was an old iron beast with a temper. The first time she tried to light it, the room filled with soot. Rosie, the youngest of Clayton's children, coughed so hard she cried. "I'm sorry," Akacheta said softly, waving the smoke away. The child just stared, thumb pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide and uncertain. The older two were no easier. Micah, 8, had his father's cold eyes and his mother's ghost behind them. He moved through the house like a sentinel, quiet but watchful, always where she least expected. Eli, 6, followed at a distance, copying his brother's every glance. They didn't speak much, and when they did, it was in short, measured words. It was as though their voices had been buried alongside their mother. Clayton wasn't much different. He worked from before dawn until after dark, fixing fences, tending to horses, mending things that didn't need mending just to keep his hands busy. He spoke little, and when he did, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd already said everything worth saying in life. But there was no meanness in him, just distance. Some nights, when the wind outside screamed like a wounded thing, Akacheta would find little folded notes near the stove, written in a steady square hand. Boil the beans longer. Use oak wood. It burns hotter. Rosie likes her porridge sweet. She never saw him write them. They just appeared, quiet as snowfall. She started leaving her own kind of messages in return. A loaf of warm bread cooling on the counter. The fire stoked before dawn. The kitchen floor swept clean, though no one had asked. They were not words, but the house understood them. It began slowly, like the thawing of frost. The rooms that once echoed now breathed again, the faint sound of life returning, of footsteps, laughter, and the scrape of spoons at supper. Clayton noticed it too. He didn't say so, but sometimes, when he came in from the cold, he'd pause at the doorway, listening, and sometimes his hand would linger a moment longer on the doorframe before he moved on. But the town wasn't as forgiving. Word traveled faster than the wind. People in Laramie Ridge didn't take kindly to a squaw living under a white man's roof. When Akacheta went into town for supplies, conversation stopped the moment she entered the mercantile. Folks stared, some out of curiosity, others out of disgust. Hanover, the storekeeper's wife, handed her change with 2 fingers, like touching her skin might burn. Clayton's name came up in whispers at the saloon, and the churchyard alike. "Ward's lost his wits," they'd say. "Took in an Indian girl. What's next?" She pretended not to hear. She'd heard worse before. Back on the ranch, she worked harder than ever. She mended torn shirts, patched saddlebags, tended the chickens that seemed to hate her guts. She planted winter onions and wild sage near the back porch, like her mother once did. She didn't ask permission. She just did it. One morning, when she went to feed the hens, she found Micah already there, scattering grain with one hand. His small face was serious, his breath ghosting in the cold. "They don't like you," he said matter-of-factly. "I know," she answered, kneeling beside him. "They didn't like me either when I first came." He frowned, not sure if she was joking. Then he asked, "Are you going to leave like Mama did?" The words struck deeper than he knew. She looked at him, her heart tightening. "No," she said finally. "Not unless your father sends me away." Micah didn't answer. But later that evening, she found a small feather laid on the kitchen table. Smooth, white, and perfect. She didn't need to ask where it came from. Weeks passed, and winter showed no mercy. The sky stayed iron gray for days. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind howled through the eaves like a warning. Still, the ranch kept breathing. Rosie began following Akacheta from room to room, tugging at her skirts. Eli started helping carry wood, proud of his small strength. Even Micah, cautious, brooding Micah, sometimes stayed in the kitchen long enough to listen to the stories she told while she cooked. Stories of the mountains where she'd grown up, of the coyote who stole fire from the gods, of a girl who could talk to the moon. They didn't always understand her words, but they listened anyway. One night, Clayton lingered outside the kitchen doorway while she told one of those tales. He didn't step in, didn't speak, just stood there, his shadow long against the wall, listening to the cadence of her voice. When the story ended and the children had gone to bed, she looked up and saw him there. "You tell good stories," he said quietly. "They're not stories," she replied. "They're memories." He nodded once, as if he understood, then disappeared into the dark hallway again. By February, the snow had turned to slush, and the nights had grown damp and heavy. One afternoon, Akacheta went to hang laundry on the line and saw two men on horseback near the road. Strangers. They didn't wave. They just watched. When she returned inside, Clayton was already at the window, rifle leaning against the wall. "You see them too," she said. "Neighbors," he muttered, "or what passes for them." She didn't ask what he meant. But later, when she lay in bed, she could still feel their eyes on her through the glass. It wasn't the first time she'd been looked at that way, like something wild that needed to be fenced in. But she was done running. As winter bled into the first hints of spring, the house changed again. The walls, once cold and hollow, now carried the scent of bread and pine smoke. The air hummed softly with life. One night, as the wind rattled outside, Rosie crept into Akacheta's room and crawled under her blanket without a word. "Can't sleep?" Akacheta whispered. The little girl shook her head. "Want me to sing?" Rosie nodded, pressing close. Akacheta began humming, an old Apache lullaby, low and soft. The melody rose and fell like the sway of a horse's gait, like the pulse of the land itself. Down the hall, Clayton paused mid-step when he heard it. The sound drifted through the house. Strange, ancient, beautiful. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a tomb. But outside the walls of that fragile peace, the world kept whispering. The ranch hands avoided her eyes. The preacher in town skipped the ward's name during Sunday prayers. Even the mailman had started delivering letters to the end of the road, too busy to ride up the hill. Akacheta knew it was only a matter of time before the storm beyond their fences reached their door. Still, Every night she lit the fire, baked the bread, and hummed the same song beneath her breath, because the house was no longer dead. And deep down, she knew, though she would never dare say it aloud, that the thaw had already begun. It started before dawn, that hour when the plains still slept under a blanket of frost and the sky bled from black to gray. Inside the ward house, the silence was broken by the soft whimper of a child. Rosie's fever had come like a thief in the night. By the time Akacheta reached her bedside, the little girl's cheeks burned crimson, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her breath came in small, frantic gasps. The fire in the hearth had died down to embers, and the air felt heavy, stale, and afraid. Clayton stood in the doorway, his face pale, his hands useless at his sides. He had seen death before, out on the trail, during storms, in the faces of neighbors buried by winters too long. But this kind of fear, the kind that came when you might lose your child again, froze him like stone. Without waiting for a word, Akacheta took over. She grabbed the kettle from the stove, filled it with water from the bucket by the door, and set it on the fire. Then she reached for the small pouch of deerskin she always kept tied at her waist. From it, she pulled dried herbs, willow bark, sage, and mint, and crushed them between her palms until their scent filled the air. Clayton watched, speechless, as she mixed the herbs into the boiling water and soaked a clean cloth. "Hold her up," Akacheta said, her voice calm but firm. He hesitated, then obeyed. His big hands trembled as he lifted Rosie, her little body burning against his chest. Akacheta pressed the cool cloth to the girl's skin, wiping her face, her neck, her tiny arms. Rosie whimpered once, then quieted. "She's too hot," Clayton whispered, his voice cracking. "She'll sweat it out," Akacheta replied. "We'll keep her cool, keep her drinking." She spoke like someone who had done this before, though she'd never cared for a child of her own. She brewed tea from the herbs and trickled it between Rosie's lips, bit by bit. Then she sang, low and soft, in a language Clayton didn't understand. The melody was ancient and slow, like water moving under ice. It carried through the house, brushing against the walls, filling the empty spaces between their breaths. Even the wind outside seemed to hush to listen. Clayton stood there for a long time, hands still on his daughter, watching this Apache girl who had been sold into his life, this stranger who moved like she belonged. Something deep in him stirred, something he thought long dead. By the second night, the fever had worsened. Rosie cried in her sleep, calling for her mother, the one buried out back beneath the old cottonwood tree. Each time, Akacheta rocked her gently, humming that same song of rivers and stars that never fade. She didn't sleep. Her eyes burned, her muscles ached, but she didn't stop. Between every verse, she whispered to the child in English now, her accent soft and laced with the desert wind. "You stay with me, little one. You hear? You stay." Clayton came and went, fetching water, chopping wood, pacing the floor like a caged animal. Each time he tried to speak, the words caught in his throat. So he did what he could, kept the fire steady, kept the kettle full, watched as this woman, this Indian girl, fought for his daughter's life, like she was her own blood. On the third night, Rosie's breathing slowed. Her tiny hand clutched Akacheta's sleeve weakly. The house was dark except for the glow of the fire, and outside, snow fell soundlessly, burying the world in white. Akacheta leaned close, her forehead touching the child's. She began to pray, not to the God Clayton knew, but to the spirits of her ancestors, to the earth and sky and every living thing that watched from the dark. "Let her stay," she whispered. "Take my strength, not hers." Clayton stood in the doorway again, hat in hand, shoulders slumped. He didn't know what she was saying, but he knew the sound. It was the same sound he'd made 3 years ago when he'd buried his wife, that raw, desperate pleading to anyone who might be listening. When dawn finally came, pale and trembling, Rosie opened her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, weakly, she turned her head toward Akacheta and whispered, "Thank you, Mama Akacheta." The name hung in the air like the first bird song of spring. Akacheta froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Behind her, Clayton made a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something caught between relief and heartbreak. He stepped forward, eyes glistening. The hard shell of his grief cracked, just for a moment, and in that crack was something raw, human, and painfully alive. The days that followed were slow but softer. Rosie's fever broke completely, leaving her weak but smiling. The boys, seeing their sister awake again, hovered close like small, nervous shadows. Akacheta taught Rosie to sip warm honey water and fed her thin soup from a spoon carved of birch. She brushed the child's tangled hair and sang when she couldn't sleep. Each night, Rosie insisted on holding her hand until her breathing evened out. Clayton stayed near the doorway most evenings, pretending to read or mend something that didn't need mending, just to stay close. "Her fever's gone," Akacheta told him one night, not looking up from the bed. "I know," he said. "You saved her." She shook her head. "The herbs did." He smiled faintly. "You could have let me believe it was you." Akacheta didn't smile back, but the faintest shimmer crossed her eyes. "You wouldn't have believed it anyway." He opened his mouth to answer, but she was already turning away, humming that same song under her breath. He watched her hands, steady, sure, strong, and for the first time, he realized just how much of his house now bore her touch. The fire burned hotter since she came. The meals tasted like someone cared whether you ate or not. Even the air felt different, less empty, less haunted. One evening, Clayton came in from the barn later than usual. Snow caked on his boots. He paused at the door, watching the soft light spilling from the kitchen. Akacheta was there, kneeling by Rosie's chair, helping her draw with a bit of charcoal on a scrap of paper. The boys leaned over her shoulders, their laughter quiet but real. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a dream he didn't deserve. Rosie looked up when she saw him and held up the paper proudly. "Look, Papa, it's Mama Akacheta, and you and me and the boys." The drawing was crude but full of life. Stick figures and wide smiles, the sun hanging low like a gold coin. Clayton's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he managed to say. Rosie grinned. "Mama says the sun don't forget to rise, even after the coldest nights." Akacheta's eyes flickered to his for the briefest moment, then back to the drawing. "Your daughter's smart," she said softly. He nodded, his voice rough. "Takes after her mother." Akacheta didn't ask which one he meant. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Clayton found her sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. The firelight touched her face, turning her eyes to molten amber. He wanted to say something, anything, but the right words had never come easy for him. "Thank you," he said finally. She turned, brow furrowed. "For what?" "For staying." The silence between them stretched like the prairie itself, wide, vast, endless. Then she nodded once, and he thought he saw something flicker across her face. Not forgiveness, not affection. something quieter, something truer. When he went to bed, he lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of her singing again from the other room. It wasn't love yet, but it was something close enough to start warming the walls. From that day forward, something invisible began to grow inside the ward house. Not passion, not desire. Those things came easy in a world where loneliness was common as dust. What grew here was rarer. Trust. The kind that takes root slow, beneath silence and scars. The kind that could one day stand against the wind. A heart can only stay silent for so long. Weeks passed, and winter began to loosen its grip on the Wyoming plains. The air still carried a bite, but the snow no longer screamed against the windows. It whispered. Patches of brown earth appeared between the drifts, and the sky softened to a pale blue that promised spring, though no one dared trust it yet. Inside the Ward Ranch, life moved slower, easier. Rosie's laughter returned first, bright and unguarded, followed by Eli's clumsy jokes and Micah's reluctant smiles. Even Clayton lingered longer in the kitchen these days, drinking his coffee by the stove instead of out in the barn. The house had begun to sound alive again. Still, Akacheta knew how fragile it all was. She'd lived long enough to know warmth could vanish as fast as breath on glass. Each night, as she washed the dishes or banked the fire, she'd glance at the man sitting near the window. His broad shoulders bowed under the weight of memories he never spoke of. She had started to care for him in ways that scared her, not with the desperate fire of a young girl, but with something quieter, respect, admiration, the strange ache that comes when you want to ease another's pain but know you can't. And yet, she reminded herself, she was not his equal. She was a guest in his world, maybe even a burden. It was late one evening when she heard the laughter, low, slurred, and male. It came from the barn, muffled through the wind. The clock on the wall ticked close to midnight, and the children had long since gone to bed. She hesitated at the window, then pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out into the cold. The moon was high, pale and distant. Her boots crunched softly through the snow as she neared the barn. The door was cracked open just enough for light to spill through, a warm, amber slice against the darkness. Inside, Clayton stood beside a lantern, his coat half off, a bottle between him and another man. A ranch hand from a neighboring property, red-faced and laughing too loud. "So," the man drawled, "how's life with your new wife, Ward? Must be something. Having a young Apache girl around. Bet it keeps the bed warm, huh?" Akacheta froze, her stomach turning to stone. Clayton's jaw tightened. He didn't answer at first, just stared into his drink. Then, his voice came low, sharp, defensive. "It's not like that. She's here to keep the house running, take care of the children. Nothing more." The words hung in the air like a shot. The other man laughed, muttered something crude, and poured himself another drink. But Akacheta didn't hear the rest. The blood roared in her ears. She turned and walked back toward the house, her breath catching in the cold. Inside, the warmth of the fire mocked her. The kitchen she had filled with laughter now felt hollow. Every corner whispered the same cruel echo. Nothing more. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the small table in the kitchen, a stub of candle burning low, her fingers clutching the pen like a lifeline. The English words came haltingly, each one heavy with all the things she couldn't say aloud. "If I am only a shadow, then let me vanish into the snow." She folded the letter carefully and placed it beside a small leather belt, one Clayton had mended for her months ago when the stitching came loose. He had done it quietly, without being asked, late one night after she'd gone to bed. It was the only thing she owned that bore his touch. When the candle died, she rose, wrapped herself in her coat, and stepped outside. The world was still. The snow glowed faintly under the moonlight, untouched and endless. The wind didn't bite. It welcomed, as if the plains themselves were opening their arms to her return. By the time dawn brushed the horizon pink, her footprints were already half buried. Clayton found the letter just after sunrise. He had come in to stoke the fire, still half asleep, when his eyes caught the folded paper on the table. He read it once, then twice. When he saw the belt beside it, his hands began to tremble. He didn't call for her, didn't even put on his breakfast coffee. Within minutes, he was out the door, his boots pounding against the frozen ground as he saddled his horse. The snow had started falling again, light but steady. Each flake erased a piece of her path. But he rode anyway. He followed what faint tracks remained, tiny indentations leading away from the house, across the ridge, down toward the creek that ran slow and black beneath a crust of ice. The wind cut his face raw. His fingers went numb on the reins. Hours passed before he saw her. She sat on a fallen log near the half-frozen stream, coat drawn tight, her dark hair tangled by the wind. She looked small against the endless white, fragile but defiant, like a lone pine tree refusing to bow. Clayton dismounted slowly. His boots sank deep into the snow as he walked toward her. "Akacheta," he said, his voice rough. She didn't turn. He stopped a few paces away, breathing hard. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the wind and the creak of his leather gloves. "I didn't mean those words," he said finally. His voice broke halfway through. "I said them to shut that fool up. I thought I was protecting your name." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't protect someone by pretending they don't matter." Clayton flinched. "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry." The wind carried his breath away, but his voice didn't waver. "I don't know how to love right," he confessed. "Never did. When Clara died, I sealed every door that could hurt again. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the pain would too. But then you came, raising my children, fixing what I'd broken, and suddenly this house could breathe again." His words hung there, warm against the cold. Akacheta's eyes filled, though the tears froze before they could fall. "I didn't want you to love me," she whispered. "I just wanted to matter." Clayton took a step closer, snow crunching beneath his boots. "You do," he said, voice trembling. "More than you'll ever know." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. The sound of two hearts learning to beat in the same cold air. He knelt down before her, hat in hand. The wind tangled his hair, stung his face red. "I can't promise I'll be the man you deserve," he said quietly, "but I can promise you'll never be invisible again." Akacheta looked at him for a long moment. The walls she'd built around herself, stone by stone, scar by scar, shivered under the weight of those words. Then, slowly, she reached out. Her fingers brushed his, small and cold and shaking. He closed his hand around hers. The world seemed to pause. The river, the snow, even the wind, as if waiting to see what would come next. Finally, Akacheta whispered, "You found me." Clayton smiled faintly, a tired, broken thing. "I wasn't about to lose you too." They rode home in silence, side by side. The snow fell softer now, the kind that melted on skin instead of stinging it. When the ranch came into view, a small smudge of gray against the horizon, Akacheta's eyes filled again. Rosie was standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket too big for her, waving both arms. Micah and Eli were beside her, wide-eyed and anxious. When they saw the two riders, Rosie let out a cry of joy that carried across the field. Clayton glanced at Akacheta. "Told you," he said, his voice low and rough. "You matter here." She didn't answer. But when she stepped off the horse and Rosie ran into her arms, the last of the ice around her heart finally cracked. That night, after the children were asleep, the house sat in its usual quiet. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt alive. Clayton stood by the hearth, watching her tend the fire. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said softly. "Maybe not," she answered, still staring at the flames. "But sometimes mercy don't wait for deserving." He looked at her then, not as the girl who'd been traded for silver, not as the stranger who mended his house, but as the woman who'd brought it back to life. And for the first time, Akacheta didn't look away. By the time the thaw came, the plains had changed their color, white giving way to the soft gold of early grass, the muddy smell of earth waking up. The Ward Ranch no longer felt like a house haunted by echoes. It breathed again. Clayton and Akacheta moved through their days like wind and earth, different but meant to meet. There weren't many words between them, but they didn't need them anymore. The silence had turned from a wound into a rhythm. She fixed what grief had stolen. Morning started with her voice, a low hum of Apache songs drifting through the kitchen as she baked bread or brushed Rosie's hair. The children began to know those melodies by heart, even if they didn't understand the words. Micah, once guarded and angry, had started to soften. He worked beside his father now, mending fences, breaking in the young horses. He didn't flinch when Akacheta called him in for supper anymore. Eli followed wherever his big brother went, shadowing him like a pup. And Rosie bloomed in ways only love could make happen. Sometimes, when Clayton came back from the fields, he'd stop before stepping inside. He'd listen to the laughter, to the crackling of fire, to the faint echo of her song, and realize this was what peace sounded like. He didn't say it aloud. Men like him didn't. But somewhere deep inside, he'd started to believe again. The spring storms came sudden that year, the kind that painted the sky black by afternoon and tore fences down before supper. It was during one of those storms that everything changed. Micah and Eli were in the pasture, rounding up the horses before the rain hit. The clouds rolled in low, angry and gray. Thunder growled like something alive. Akacheta had just stepped out on the porch when she saw the flash of movement, the wild bay horse bucking hard, its eyes rolling white. Eli stood too close. "Micah!" she screamed. The wind swallowed her voice. Micah saw it, too late. He pushed his brother back, hands outstretched, just as the horse kicked. There was a sickening crack, and then silence, sharp and wrong. The boy crumpled into the mud, still as a fallen branch. "Micah!" Clayton was already running, his boots pounding against the soaked ground. By the time he reached the boy, his shirt was plastered to his skin, rain and tears mixed on his face. He lifted Micah into his arms, the boy's head limp against his chest. Blood streaked his temple. "Hold on, son. You hear me? Hold on!" They brought him inside. Akacheta cleared the table and laid the boy there, her hands steady though her heart was breaking. Rosie sobbed quietly in a corner. Eli wouldn't stop whispering, "It's my fault, it's my fault," until Clayton pulled him close and said, hoarse and raw, "No, you hear me, boy? It ain't." Then he turned to Akacheta. "Do something," he pleaded. "I will," she said, her voice barely more than breath. She brewed tea from the same herbs she'd used for Rosie long ago, sage, mint, willow bark. But this time her hands trembled. She wiped the blood from Micah's face, pressed cool cloths to his forehead, whispered prayers in 2 tongues, one for the land, one for the soul. Clayton sat nearby, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. "I wanted to make him strong," he said, voice breaking, "but I broke him instead." Akacheta stopped her work just long enough to look at him. "No," she said quietly. "You taught him courage. He used it to save his brother." Clayton didn't answer. His jaw trembled, and he stood suddenly, pacing like a caged animal. "If he dies..." He couldn't finish. "He won't," she said. But her own voice wavered. For 3 nights, the ranch was a place of waiting. Outside, the wind screamed against the shutters. Inside, time slowed to the beat of Micah's shallow breaths. The other children slept in fits, clutching each other. Clayton barely ate. He'd sit by the window, staring out at the storm, gripping the same Bible his wife once kept on the dresser, though he never opened it. Akacheta didn't leave the boy's side. She spoke to him softly, telling him stories from her people. The warrior who found his courage in the dark, the coyote who tricked death by pretending to be asleep. Sometimes she'd hum that same song, the one about the river that never stopped flowing, no matter how many stones tried to block it. By the 3rd night, the storm outside had gone quiet. Only the steady drip of water from the eaves broke the silence. Micah's breathing slowed again, weaker this time. His skin had gone pale, his lips dry. Akacheta pressed a hand to his chest. "Come back, little one," she whispered. "We're all waiting." She bent close to his ear, her tears falling onto his cheek. "Rosie drew you a picture today. Eli's keeping your boots by his bed. And your father." Her voice broke. "He blames himself for everything. Don't let him carry that." Her head bowed as she whispered, "You're not allowed to give up on us, Micah Ward. Not now. Not when we finally learned how to love again." The room was still. Then, barely a flicker, his fingers twitched. "Clayton!" she gasped. The man was on his feet before she could finish. He rushed to the table just as Micah's eyelids fluttered open. The boy blinked, confused, his eyes unfocused. "Mama," he rasped, voice weak as wind. "Did you cry for me?" The words shattered the silence. Akacheta covered her mouth, sobs breaking free at last. "Yes," she whispered through tears. "Yes, I cried for you." Clayton staggered back against the wall, pressing a hand to his chest as if trying to hold his heart together. Micah's eyes closed again, but this time he was breathing steady. By morning, the sun had returned. The sky was a clear, aching blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The Ward Ranch had survived another storm. Clayton stood outside the house, staring out at the horizon. His hands were calloused, his shoulders bent, but his eyes, those gray, storm-tired eyes, had softened. When Akacheta came to stand beside him, he didn't speak. He just reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm, firm, grateful. Inside, Micah slept, Rosie curled up beside him, Eli guarding the foot of the bed like a small soldier. The house felt full, not of noise but of breath, of life. Akacheta watched the sky lighten and said, "The land forgave the storm." Clayton nodded. "And maybe," he said slowly, "so did I." That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Clayton lit a lantern out by the pasture. He'd done it every night since Clara died. A single light, left burning in her memory. But tonight, he hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he walked back inside and set the lantern on the windowsill instead. The flame flickered between them, past and present, sorrow and grace, melting into one steady glow. He looked at Akacheta. "You stayed," he said quietly. "I told you once," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "I don't leave when it rains." Clayton smiled then, small, real, the kind of smile that comes from a place too deep for words. Outside, the plains stretched wide and wild beneath the stars. Inside, the house that once belonged to ghosts now held the sound of a boy breathing, a fire burning, and two hearts learning how to heal. Spring had finally come to Wyoming. The kind of spring that didn't just arrive, it conquered. The hills rolled out their colors like a quilt stitched by heaven itself. Golden poppies, violet asters, and the tall wild grass whispering secrets to the wind. The long, cruel winter was over. Clayton Ward stood on the ridge above his ranch, watching the meadow below come alive again. And beside him, where there had once been only sorrow and silence, stood Apache. The years had taken much from him. His first wife, his peace, his faith. But this woman, this quiet, steady force of the earth, had given him something rarer. A reason to breathe again. He led her down the slope toward a meadow she had never seen before, a place hidden beneath the wide arms of an old oak. Beneath that oak rested Clara, his late wife, her ashes scattered among the wildflowers 3 years earlier. The air there felt different, gentle, like a church made by God's own hands. Clayton stopped beside the oak and turned to her. He looked down at his calloused hands before reaching into his coat pocket. "I want to show you something," he said softly. He handed her a small cloth bundle tied with twine. Inside was a string of pearls, faintly yellowed with age but still glimmering in the sunlight. "My mother gave this to Clara on our wedding day," he said, his voice low, reverent. "Said it was to be passed on to the woman who'd raise the next Ward children." Apache's breath caught. "And now you give it to me?" Clayton nodded once. "I didn't know what it meant back then, but now, I do." He took her hands, the same hands that had once been rough with labor and now carried warmth enough to heal a house, and closed them around the pearls. Their wedding wasn't grand. There were no preachers, no fine clothes, no gathering of townsfolk. Just the open field, the whisper of wind through the grass, and 3 children who had already learned that love didn't need a church to make it holy. Micah stood tall beside his father, his hair combed neatly, but his shirt half untucked like always. Eli held a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself, and Rosie wore a crown of daisies that sat crooked on her curls. Clayton and Apache faced one another beneath the oak tree, sunlight dappling their faces through the branches. "I never thought I'd stand here again," Clayton said quietly, taking her hands. "But I thank God I am." Apache smiled through tears. "And I never thought I'd find a home among strangers." He looked at her with that slow, sure kind of love only a man who's lost everything once can give. "You aren't a stranger anymore." When the vows were spoken, the moment felt still enough to make the whole world listen. And when Clayton kissed her, the wind rose up and carried the sound across the hills like a blessing. Rosie clapped her small hands and shouted, "You look beautiful, Mama." Even Micah cracked a smile. "You do," he said solemnly. "You really do." They all laughed, something they hadn't done together in years, and it echoed through the valley, bright and true. That night, they celebrated the only way people who've known hardship know how. Simply, with gratitude. A small fire burned in the yard. They roasted bread, shared stew, and told stories long into the evening. The children dozed off one by one, their laughter fading into the hum of crickets. And then, as the fire dwindled, an old wagon creaked its way up the dirt path. The man who stepped down was hardly recognizable. Thin, gray, his hands trembling from age and guilt. Akacheta's uncle. He removed his hat, eyes downcast. "I heard tell there was a wedding," he rasped. "And I came to say something I should have said long ago." Clayton stood protectively close, but Akacheta held up a hand, her expression unreadable. Her uncle swallowed hard. "I sold you like a mule, thought I was saving myself. Truth is, I was just a coward. You deserved better than what I gave you, girl." For a long time, she said nothing. The fire cracked between them, sending sparks into the night air. Then she stepped closer, her gaze steady, her voice even. "I forgive you," she said, "but I will not forget." Her uncle's shoulders slumped in quiet relief. "That's fair," he whispered. When he turned to leave, Clayton placed a small flask in his hands. "For the road," he said simply. The old man nodded once and climbed back onto the wagon. As the wheels rolled away, Akacheta stood watching until the darkness swallowed him whole. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Forgiveness, she'd learned, wasn't about letting someone back in. It was about letting them go. Weeks later, the first rain of spring returned. It came soft and steady, a kind rain that didn't destroy but healed. The hills glistened under it, the scent of earth rising rich and clean. Clayton found her standing barefoot in the field, her hair plastered to her shoulders, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. For a moment, he just watched her, the woman who'd once arrived in his life with nothing but a shawl and a stubborn kind of grace. Now she stood rooted in his land, his heart, his future. He stepped closer and brushed the rain from her cheek. "You didn't just save me, Akacheta," he said quietly. "You saved this whole house." She smiled faintly, leaning into his touch. "The house saved itself. It just needed someone to remind it how." He laughed softly, the sound rough but tender, like gravel carried by water. "Then we did all right, didn't we?" She nodded. "We did." Together they dug into the wet earth beside the old oak where Clara's ashes rested. The rain fell gently on their hands as they worked. Rosie and the boys helped, their small fingers patting down clumps of mud with solemn care. When the hole was ready, Akacheta placed the sapling in it, a white cotton tree, young and slender, its roots reaching into the same soil that held both grief and rebirth. Clayton pressed his palm against the earth, whispering, "Let it grow, even through drought and storm." Akacheta laid her hand over his. "And when it flowers," she said, "we'll know love still lives here." The children joined them, each pressing a hand to the ground. Rosie closed her eyes and murmured, "Please grow fast, little tree." The wind rose then, not harsh, but playful, and the branches above rustled like applause. Years later, folks in Laramie Ridge would talk about the Ward Ranch again, though the whispers had changed. They'd say there was an Apache woman out there who could tame storms, who'd turned sorrow into song. Some said her voice carried across the valley on calm nights, singing to the cotton tree that bloomed twice a year, once for the woman who'd come before her, and once for the family she'd saved. And under that same sky, Clayton and Akacheta built a life. Not easy, not without scars, but honest. Each morning he'd find her by the porch with coffee in one hand, her other hand resting lightly on her growing belly. The children would chase chickens through the yard, their laughter rising like sunlight. And every spring, when the cotton tree bloomed, the petals would drift through the air like snow, but warmer, alive, a promise that even the coldest hearts can learn to love again. On the last night of that first spring together, Clayton stood by the window, looking out at the cotton tree glowing pale in the moonlight. Akacheta came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, and smiled. "That I've been given 2 lives," he said. "One before you, and one after." She looked up at him, her eyes soft as dusk. "Then promise you'll live both of them well." "I intend to," he said. Outside, thunder murmured far off, gentle this time, almost like a lullaby. The wind carried the scent of rain and cotton blossoms through the open window. And there, beneath the vast Wyoming sky, they stood in the quiet rhythm of love not born of chance, but of choice. A love that had been traded, tested, forgiven, and finally, reborn under the same sky.